Chess has always been a male-dominated world. Bobby Fischer famously stated that he could give knight odds to any female player and still beat them. Fast forward and we're in 1988 at the Chess Olympiad, where a team of teenage girls from Hungary makes headlines by winning gold ahead of the Soviet women's team, after 30 years of Soviet domination. The team consisted of the three Polgar sisters and Ildikó Madl, the top scorer being the youngest member of the team, 12-year-old Judit Polgar. She scored an outstanding 12.5 points out of 13 games, and her play caught the attention of not just the international media, but the reigning world chess champion himself, Garry Kasparov, who passed by Judit's board during one of the rounds. When Judit looked up, seeing her idol watching her game, she could barely believe it. Kasparov was asked about Judit after the event, and he said that he was sure that Judit would become the women's world champion, but he thought it was almost impossible that she would be able to challenge the top male players in the world. In 1989 January, Judit is ranked number 55 in the world, breaking Bobby Fischer's and Garry Kasparov's record in entering the top 100 by rating. In 1991, she's playing the Hungarian Super Championship, the national championship that included all the best players of Hungary. She's 15 at the time and is leading the tournament with one round to go. In the last round, she has to win in order to win the championship, but a draw would be enough for her to achieve her third and final Grandmaster norm and become the youngest ever Grandmaster in history, beating Bobby Fischer's record. What do you think Judit did? We shall see the game. Her opponent is Grandmaster Tibor Tolnai, and Judit is playing with the black pieces, her favorite defense, the Sicilian. Normally Judit played the Taimanov variation, but in this game she goes for a6, the Khan variation, so the Taimanov being knight c6, which was Judit's favorite variation, and in this game, as a surprise, she prepared a6. Knight c3, queen c7, and f4. This is the variation Judit expected, as her opponent likes attacking chess as well, just like Judit. Although another variation that Judit recommends and she played as white often is bishop d3 in this position. So the game went with queen c7, f4, b5, bishop d3, bishop b7, and queen f3. An aggressive way of playing, preparing for castle queenside. And that's exactly what Judit wanted, a dynamic, complex game. Knight f6, now that the queen is on f3, we can develop the knight, there's no e5 anymore. Bishop to e3, knight c6, and castle queenside. Judit advances b4, chasing the knight away from c3. Knight c to e2, and now a typical knight maneuver in the Sicilian, knight a5, heading toward the c4 square. White plays g4. He has already castled, so he launches his attack on the king side, threatening g5, and the knight has nowhere to go but back to g8. Therefore, Judit needs a place for that piece, pushes d5, a thematic advance in the Sicilian, breaking in the center. e5 is the normal response to d5, and now she had two options, either to place the knight on e4, which she says looks very active, but she thought that the knight was more useful on d7, because she can maneuver to c5 afterwards. King b1 is a prophylactic move, preparing for knight c4, which was Judit's next move, attacking the dark squared bishop. Now that the king has moved to b1, this bishop can drop back to c1, protecting the queen side and simply keeping this bishop alive, as that's an important piece for white in these positions. Judit here was looking at one of her favorite blows in the Sicilian, one of her favorite ideas. This is a thematic idea, to push g5 and weaken the e5 pawn. She was calculating this variation, but it does not work here, as white could simply play f5, and the position is extremely complex after the capture on e5 and queen e3, a pawn-up for black, in fact. But Judith said that this position she would definitely choose white here. By the way, I'm quoting Judith, and I'm going to be quoting Judith throughout this analysis, as I have read her book, Judith Teaches Chess. This is volume number 1, How I Beat Bobby Fischer's Record. Am I revealing the result already? Hopefully not. Queen e3, and she would prefer this position as white has the initiative for the sacrificed pawn. Therefore, she didn't like the complications after g5 and that she would lose the initiative. Instead, she plays castle queenside. Well, lose the initiative. She hasn't gained it yet, but we know Judith's style. She prefers to be on the attack and have less material instead of gaining material and having to defend. Castle queenside, h4. As if the opponent realized, it seems like he did realize that Judith was aiming for the g5 push. After castle queenside, she was threatening g5 already. Knight c5. Simply improving the knight, and in the future it could either take on d3 or head toward a4, e4, so many squares available for the knight. White played b3 to defend the a4 square and attack this knight, although it's not hanging. In this position, black could play anything. This knight won't be captured. It's not possible to win the piece because the long diagonal opens up and black is winning back material. Actually, black is winning even more material because both the rook and the knight on e2 will be hanging after the capture on d3. Even like this, that the knight is not hanging, Judith decided to play knight a3 check because she believes that the knight is better on a3 in this position, attacking the king. The king has to move. Black would be very happy if white gives up the bishop with these weakened dark squares around the white king. Knight a3 check, king a1, and in this moment Judith played f6, a move that she criticizes afterwards. She says that she played this move too quickly after only 9 minutes of thinking, and in principle the idea is correct to break in the center, but black's pieces are not optimal, and that could have led to quite a disaster. Maybe not disaster, but she didn't like that after f6, white could have taken on f6, g takes f6, and now c3. She gives an exclamation mark to this move and says that black's position is falling apart. Maybe the position is not that bad, but she definitely didn't like what could have appeared on the board in case of a capture on f6 and c3. Instead, the opponent made a mistake too, an inaccurate move. The right idea, but the wrong move order, c3 immediately, which allows f takes e5, f takes e5, and now a beautiful move that Judith was very proud of, knight c4. The knight is going back to c4. Remember that we had the knight on c4 earlier, and it's the same motive. This knight cannot be captured because black wins material. She wins material again in this opening of the long diagonal. So what was the point of going to a3 with a check and then coming back 3 moves later? Well, the circumstances have changed. So this is a new position, and now it makes sense after having provoked weaknesses in white's camp. It makes a lot of sense to come back with the knight to c4. Judith's opponent in this moment thought that he has a nice tactical motive, and so he played knight takes e6, which looks like a very strong move, attacking the queen, which means that knight takes e6 seems forced. But if black takes on e6, b takes c4, d takes c4, and now white can play bishop e4. Remember that in the position with the knight on c4, b takes c4, d takes c4. White cannot play bishop e4 because this knight on c5 is covering the e4 square, both the bishop and the knight, and that's why black is winning material here. So knight takes e6 seems to be a genius idea, forcing knight takes e6 and then taking on c4, bishop e4. And white is much better here. Is knight takes e6 forced? Well, Judit did realize that it wasn't forced at all. She goes for a counter-attacking move. Knight takes e5. Yes, her queen is hanging, but white's queen is hanging as well. This is a move that her opponent missed. And when you miss a move, it's difficult to see with clarity how to follow. Perhaps the best move for white would be queen f5. That's what Judit analyzes in her book, and she highlights that after g6, knight takes c7 check, g takes f5, bishop takes f5 check, sacrificing this knight, so it would be a piece up for black. White has two pawns after c takes b4, but it is a complicated position, difficult to evaluate. Should be somewhat better for black because of the piece up, but it isn't clear. It isn't a clear position. After knight takes e5, white played queen g3, and now Judit can take on e6, bishop f5 to win the piece back, and Judit doesn't mind giving it back immediately. She could have tried to hold on to the piece by playing rook e8, and after knight d4, it looks like white is winning back the material. Knight d7 though would have been interesting, but this is a different story. She prefers having the initiative, giving back material, but gaining the initiative, as after bishop takes e6, b takes c3 is very strong. Knight takes c3 and d4. We are on move 25 at this moment, and just have a look at Judit's kingside. She doesn't mind that she couldn't develop the f8 bishop and the rook on h8 yet, because it's all about winning the initiative. d4, attacking the knight and the rook on h1, gaining tempo. And she writes in her book, I was getting more and more inspired by my position, and I felt that the atmosphere in the playing hall was tense. It felt as though the spectators knew they were going to witness something extraordinary. A little girl winning the championship ahead of so many great players. Not to mention breaking Fischer's record. This is how Judit felt in this moment of the game. And I find it extraordinary that we can relive her thoughts. 15-year-old Judit Polgar sharing with us through her book how she felt during this game. Rook h f1, bishop b4, knight a4 and rook h e8, and here she continues the previous thought process. I remember that with such a harmonious setup, I felt I was getting close to the win. Objectively, this is largely exaggerated, since black is only better, not winning. However, if we add the psychological initiative was on my side, we can state that subjectively I was right. And so the result shall justify. Let's see what happened afterwards. Better position for black, as Judit said, and she was feeling that she is winning this game, this very important game. Bishop f5, bishop c6, preparing to eliminate this knight, which is defending the important dark squares around white's king. Bishop b2, g6. Now this poor bishop has nowhere to go but b1. And Judit decides to simplify the position by playing bishop takes a4 and bishop c3. She says in her book that after bishop b1, she could have played d3, which should be the strongest move objectively. But in this tournament situation, where she only needed a draw to break Bobby Fischer's record, she didn't think it was necessary to go for a complex position, even if that is objectively the strongest move. Her opponent is a tactician, and he would certainly enjoy more a position where, even though he's worse, he has tricks, he can play for tricks, he can find tactical motives. Instead, Judit plays on the psychological factor as well, and she chooses an endgame where she would be better, and that would mean that her opponent had to be defending without having any tactical possibilities. After the trade of queens on c3, rook c1, she supports her passed pawn with rook c8, and just to pause for a moment why this endgame is better for black. First of all, it feels like a pawn up, because of having a c passed pawn, and white has doubled 8 a pawns, so the number of pawns are the same, but she optically and also in the game, it feels like she has an extra pawn, the c passed pawn. Apart from that, her knight is dominating the bishop. The bishop doesn't have a useful diagonal. All these squares are protected, controlled by black. Another factor is that now she's activating her rooks as well, so she's about to play rook c4 and cash in on the 4th rank where all the white pawns are, or double rooks on the c5 first, both ideas. So the black pieces are more active and it feels like a pawn up for black. Those are the factors that make this position, this endgame, better for black, and that's why Judit went for this variation. Her opponent played rook f4 here, and Judit says that she found this move too passive. She believed that h5 was absolutely necessary in order to trade pawns on the king side and try to activate this bishop. Rook f4 to prevent rook c4. Judit plays rook c5 to double rooks. Rook b4 check, king a7 and rook b3. She says that even in this position, still h5 would be the move. It should be the move in order to activate this bishop. Rook b3 was played instead. She doubles rooks to protect her passed pawn. Bishop e4, threatening rook b7 check. She defends the b7 square, and after rook cb1, forcing knight c6. This was basically white's idea, to go for a rook endgame. But it is still a bad endgame for white because of the same reason, a passed pawn that is very strong, supported by the two rooks, and she can also play rook c4, attacking more white pawns. Rook b4 to protect the c4 square, but rook c4 comes anyway, and after a3, rook takes b4, a takes b4, rook c4, and h5. Finally, a bit late, but finally white plays h5, maybe in the wrong moment, because here, if you pause the video for a moment, can you try to find the last blow, the last detail in this position, the finishing touch that wins the game? What is the move that Judit Polgar played here? Pause the video if you need to, and I shall tell you the move. A5! Exclamation mark! Who said that there can be no tactical motives in endgames? The pawn cannot be captured because rook takes a4 is mate. Mate with just a rook and a pawn. Isn't it beautiful? a5 winning the game. H takes g6, h takes g6, but still all the pawns on the 4th rank are hanging. King a2. Rook takes b4, of course the king and pawn endgame would be winning for black, therefore rook g1 was played, and now instead of the capture on a4, which would allow king b3, Judit pushes c2, pinning the white rook onto the back rank. It cannot abandon the c1 square, and the king on a2 is cut on the b5, g5, king b6, and white resigned because he cannot do anything. As mentioned, the rook is passive, the king is cut, he's a pawn down, this pawn is about to be promoted, and all that black needs to do is to activate her king as well, and the endgame is easily winning. With this win, Judit Polgar became the youngest Grandmaster at the time, beating Bobby Fischer's record. And also, together with her Grandmaster title, she received the title of Hungarian champion. Later on, Judit broke into the top 10 and became a regular face at elite tournaments. Did she manage to challenge Garry Kasparov though? In 2001, they play a mini-match in Linares that ends with 2 draws, 2 very exciting games that I do recommend that you check out, as well as her game from 2002 at the Russia versus Rest of the World match, where Judit Polgar for the first time manages to defeat Garry Kasparov, and this is the one and only moment in history where a female player defeats the world number 1. In 2014, she retires after having led the women's ranking for 26 years. Nowadays, her life is still all about chess, with special focus on education and improving children's skills through chess. We could say that from being the greatest female player of all time and a role model to many of us, she has become the greatest promoter of chess, with her slogan, "Chess connects us."